Hello, hello! It seems that we are live and I get started right away. No sound check this time. Welcome back to this epic series of 2 episodes. This is going to be number 2. Welcome back after 1 week. If you haven't seen the live stream last week, you should do that first and then come back. All the live streams are recorded anyway, so they are on YouTube available at the same URL later. The first video that we did last week, or that I did last week, was an introduction to how you build panel plugins, field plugins for Kirby with our new plugin kit, which is a setup around Parcel.js to build those plugins with a nice build process and hot module reloading and all those kind of nice things that you need to build plugins. And yeah, this time in this video, we are going to take that exact same state that we had last week at the end of the video, and we are going to continue. Just give me maybe a thumbs up in the chat if you can hear me, so I don't keep on talking and it's worth for nothing. Let's continue anyway. So this is the state that we had last week. This was a very simple field that you can see on the left here. So it's not very pretty. It was more about just getting the functionality right, getting the setup done and working, and showing a few basics like how to work with view props and view components in general, how to pass the input event from the input fields to the panel, and what happens then when the input event works, and so on. So in the end, what we finished with is this very ugly little plugin that you can use to type, and it will make changes, and you can save those changes, and the changes and then appear in the text file right away. So everything is connected with the backend and everything works. So in this video, taking this as the starting point, we want to make this a little more pretty, and especially more in line with what we have normally in Kirby, which looks completely different to what we see here. So let's just add a little reference field, one of our normal text fields. Make that type text. To give you an idea, maybe you never see this before, you probably have. So this is a test field. By the way, I zoomed in quite a lot after some feedback last time that the screen resolution is quite high, and so it's pretty difficult to spot things in the live stream, so I hope this helps. So everything is a bit zoomed in. If it looks weird, that might be the reason. I've zoomed in code, in Studio Code, and I also zoomed in the browser, so just to give you that as an information. So this is a normal text field, which looks quite different, as you can see. And one of the first tasks that we are going to solve in this live stream is that we want to design this field to look more like a regular field without actually designing too much, because that would be kind of wasteful. So we want to build a field that looks nice, but without writing hardly or even any CSS in the end. So let's remove that first and go back to our component. And in our component, we did everything last week manually. So there is a manual div with a class, and there's a label, and there's an input field, and there is no CSS down here, so nothing is really looking great. And we would need to write quite a lot of CSS now, and we have all those components ready already. So we have a label, we have the input styles, the focus styles, all this stuff is already available in all our default fields. And there is quite a good way to reuse that. And since we are working with Vue.js, we can use our own components that we provide from the panel interface, our component library, and use them in the plugins. And the first component we are going to use is the field component. It's called KayFields. And we are going to replace the div with that field component. We can leave the class as it is. That's fine, but the div is being replaced with the field component. All our components have that prefix. So they all follow the same name ruling. So they have a K and a dash and then the name of the component. And in fact, all those components that you see here or that you might be wanting to use in your own plugins, they are available in our docs. So we have in our reference, let me go back to the docs to show you where you can find them. So if you click on reference here and then you go further down to UI kit, you get a reference of all our components, and you can see all kinds of things here. Where's the field? Somewhere is the field. It's not sorted alphabetically. Oh yeah, it is. Okay, should have looked that up. Where's the field? Whatever. So all the components should be in there. I will double check where the field is. That's kind of weird. So normally you get the information about all those components. You get examples how to use them. You get all the props that are available. You get the methods that are available. You get the events that are being sent by the components. So you can normally look them up there. So yeah, as I said, the first field the first component that we are going to use is the KayFields. It doesn't change much so far. It just did a weird thing with the margin here. I'm going to explain that in a second. But that KayFields component is quite useful to take a lot of the extra work that we would need to do from us and does it for us. So the first thing we can do with the KayField is we can pass the label to it as a property, and we can remove this. And as soon as we do that, you can see the label appears here, and it has already the design that the other field labels have. It has the correct margin to the input below, so it fits well with the rest of the labels in our forms. That would be the first thing, quite useful, and especially useful if you don't want to care about all those things that are connected with the label. We will see that in a second. The next thing we can tell this field is that it might have some help texts. Let's do that as a normal string and say, okay, this is some help. For those of you who use Kirby already quite a lot, you will know that all our fields have a help option in the blueprint. So you can pass in help text that will then appear below the field, which is a pretty good way to give instructions to your editors, put in some like minimal documentation around different kinds of things that they can put in there. So maybe you have some kind of style guides around the content and you want to give some extra hints to what is to be considered when they add a title, or when they add a headline, or when they upload an image or something like that. So the help text goes in there, and instead of recreating that help text manually or that help text container manually in your own field, you can use that help property here and pass in the help text. Later, what we want to do, as we do with the label, is we want to get that from a prop. So we are going to create a help prop. It's also a string, and the help text will be coming from that prop. Next thing we can do is we can say that the field is required. Let's just pass in true to demonstrate this, and you might have spotted that an asterisk appears here. So that is automatically being put on next to the label, and the title should appear as well. So if you hover over it, you see that this field is required appears there. So that automatically is being injected into the label from the field component. It takes care of that as well, which is also quite useful oftentimes. Again, this would be connected with a property, with a required property. In this case, the required property is a Boolean, so it's either true or false, or should be true or false. So we can pass that as the type for the prop. And then our required asterisk appears, or it doesn't appear. Now it doesn't appear because the field is not set as to be required. If we go back into our blueprint, we can set it to required again, and then you have the same effect. So field is marked as a required, asterisk appears, all is fine. The required attribute is another special thing because it also takes care of validating required fields whenever a field is saved. So that will automatically happen in the backend as soon as you put that into the blueprint and you try to save it without some content. The error appears and it will automatically tell you, no, it's required, please fill in something. So backend validation is done here for you as well. Another important attribute is the disabled attribute or disabled prop. I'm switching between prop and attribute all the time because when talking about HTML elements, it's more like attributes. When talking about components, it's more like props. So yeah, I hope you understand what I mean. Disabled also takes care of a few things. So it will take care of switching off any kind of pointer events in the field. So you can't click it anymore. It will give you this blocked cursor here. So you can't, you instantly see that this field is disabled. We also want to get that from a prop in the end. So it should be connected with our blueprint. Oh, wait, I forgot it up here. Disabled. And then we can now disable this. And disabled properties also have an effect on the backend. So as soon as a field is marked as disabled in the blueprint, you can't store it anymore. So even if you would now try to save that field manually with an API request, that would be blocked. So the field can't be stored anymore. It can only be read. That's kind of the effect to it. So those are the most important things that are required, or that not really required, but they are available for you to use in the fields component, and they build a nice wrapper for your content. And then in the end, you really just have to care about what happens in the middle. Let's do the help thing quickly so we get to see that as well. This is some help. So help text appears also as an option, being passed as a property and then being injected into a field wrapper and then being rendered for you in the design of the field that the field helper normally has. But what this kind of component doesn't solve for us is the design of our input. So the input still looks like crap, just to be honest. So we need to solve that as well. And there is an input component, or there are many input components that replace the regular HTML input components. So we have, I think we have for all the native input components, we have an alternative for Kirby, and they are called K-input. So we have K-input type text, K-input type URL, K-input type tell, K-input type email, passwords, etc., etc. So all those inputs that you would input types that you would normally expect are there as well in this input component. And the component again does multiple things for us. By default, it doesn't really look as expected, so it doesn't have the white frame that we would normally see, or the focus style that we normally see. The input elements, when they are used like this, try to be as undesigned as possible. So the only thing that they really do is resetting or adjusting the text. So they inherit the text from the surroundings. The idea around this is that you can use this input components in multiple ways. So you can use them in your own components and build your own wrapper around them, design them in a way that you like, and use them as a one-to-one replacement to native inputs. But they have a theme property, and that theme property can be set to field. And then they instantly look like a field input. And then when it's disabled, so I have to remove that. Also going to remove the required attribute for now. And then when I reload, you should see the focus style is there. When you click it, it instantly works as expected. It looks like the other field inputs, and it does all the design work again for us. There's one specialty though, Let me wrap this again so you can read it a bit better in the stream. There's one specialty though. The input element also takes care of sending the right value to you in the input event. So instead of what we did before, with the native input element is we got a native HTML event here, and then from the event we chose the target, which was the input, and from the target we use the value. And we can completely get rid of this, and we get the pure value from the input event, because that's what matters when something is being stored in the input. So that's just the major difference between the native input event elements and our custom input element, which is quite useful. And then we end up with the same functionality as before. You can type, you can enter something, it's being submitted, or it's being put, it's being emitted to the panel. The panel can then take it, put it into local storage, or save it on disk, whatever you currently do as a user. So we got the same state as before with minimal, with just a few lines of code, but we got quite a lot of extra functionalities here, and also extra design around our fields, which is quite cool. And I'm going to show you a few things that the input elements can do additionally. So they have more functionalities and more features than normal native input elements would have. The first thing is you can specify a before text. Let's just put in before and an after text, and I'm going to show you what that does. So they are placed before the input. It still looks like this is the entire input box, but in fact the input is just starting here and going to there, and before there's the before text and the after text placed in these locations. And the intent for this is that you can use those for all kinds of things to indicate what kind of input this is. So for example, let's say you put a price, a currency sign here to make it a price field, or you can say, okay, this is an input field for a Twitter handle, or maybe indicate this is kind of an URL or some kind of special URL, and then you only specify the path. So those are the use cases for those before and after attributes or props. We also have an icon property, and that icon property can be used with all our icons that we have on board. Now I'm going to look up the icons, and I hope that I find them and not like with the field component. So this is our list of icons that we have available, and this is the icon name. So you can instantly use any of those icons that are in the list and put them in here. So for example, use the account icon. Let me switch back in the browser, and then the account icon appears here. So for all kinds of things that you want to solve, maybe indicate that this is an email field or a user field or a page field or whatever you want to build. So all this comes within this input container, and it handles all of this for you. You can click on those elements. You always end up in the input, so all of this is done for you as well, and it's quite useful. You have the typical things that you normally would have, like placeholder attribute, which can then again be connected to a property. Of course, all your properties can be connected to custom properties. They all can be connected to Blueprint options that way. So you can even make the after texts configurable, the before text, the icon, whatever you want to give your developers as option to customize can be done this way. And what I want to build in this little example is a very specialized little email field. So the idea is to have a company email field where you don't have to fill in the company name or the company address anymore, but you just fill in your own username for the email address, and then that's it. Quite nice and simple, with the after text indicating what the company is, and so you fill this in and everything's fine. As you can see, this is done very easily and very quickly. Oh, one more important thing. We also want to pass in the required attribute, because the required attribute is also needed in the input. We also want to pass in the disabled attribute here as well, because that is also useful. What this does in this case when the field is disabled is it disables it. Well, who would have guessed that? But it also takes care of the design. So that's the missing piece that hasn't been done before, is done now. So when disabled is true and the disabled property is being passed through the input, you instantly get also the design changes, and the field tunes down its background and looks a lot more disabled this way. Let's move that back. Okay, this is quite cool. We got quite far with this. You can probably, or you probably already have your own ideas how to extend this further. This is a good state. I mean, this is something that you could take and convert to all kinds of scenarios for simple inputs or extended inputs for various use cases. Let's put in some more logic into this field and demonstrate parts of the reactivity in Vue.js. So you've seen that we never really do DOM manipulation in Vue.js. For those who coming from a more traditional background in JavaScript and haven't worked with something like React or Vue.js or Svelte or whatever before, you probably have noticed that we don't ever touch the DOM so far, and we don't really do that either for more complex stuff, because we can do most of the things by just manipulating the data that we use, and then Vue.js will take care of the rest. So for example, in this little field here, what we want to avoid is that a user enters weird characters and maybe some stuff that shouldn't be in an email address. That would be like a very simple use case. And we can do this quite easily in this input event. So whenever the input changes in your field and that input is being sent back to the panel, you can intercept that and manipulate that input. So for example, simple things like, well, let's keep it really simple and say, okay, everything should be converted to lowercase, for example, as a first step. Let's revert that quickly. I can't demonstrate that well, you have to trust me. So I'm typing all kinds of uppercase characters now, and they are automatically transferred to lowercase. And what you might think now is, why does this even work? Why does the lowercase value end up in the field? And that's kind of what I was talking about with the reactivity of Vue.js. So we send the value as lowercase to the panel, and the panel stores it in local storage, as I mentioned a couple times before, but it also sends it back, or it has it in its state, and that state is always then being reflected back to the fields. So this is automatically always being synchronized with what we have in our value prop. And this is cool because the value prop is then being used in our input, and that input automatically updates, and we don't have to do anything about it. We don't have to query the DOM element for it. We don't have to change the value attribute manually. All of this is done by just binding it to that input event, and Vue.js does the rest for us. It's a blessing in like 95% of all cases. There are cases where you think like, what the fuck is going on? So be prepared that sometimes reactivity can be hard, but well, the same thing applies to DOM manipulation, as we probably all know. So we can be more specific here and maybe even replace some characters with some regex magic. So let's say, okay, every character that is not between A and Z and 0 and 9 should be replaced automatically with a dash. So that would be like a very simple slugging method to convert everything that we don't want to have in an email address. And so now I can start typing weird characters and uppercase and umlauts and all kind of things that shouldn't be ending up in an address. Of course, this could be much more specific, much more advanced, and it automatically gets applied, and then we can send it safely to the server, which is kind of cool. Let me think. Okay, that's it for the front end so far. So that would be like wrapping up our field with the input, with the design and everything in a very traditional sense. We are probably going to build a more complex, more fancy field with, I don't know, I have to still think about the use case there, but you can have a lot of interactivity in such a field, much more than we currently have, but let's keep it like this and move on to the back end, because we've never talked about the back end so far, and I want to demonstrate a few things in the back end for you before we wrap this up. So the backend code is in this index.php that you might have seen before. And we have our empty field definition here. So far, everything that we did has been connected automatically with the backend without us writing any backend code. By just taking whatever is in the blueprint file, transferring it to the front end, using it there in our Vue.js component, by defining those props that we need, and then from there on sending the input value back to the API with what the panel also does for us automatically. And so yeah, we don't have any backend code yet, which is kind of weird, but also quite nice. But what happens if we want to manipulate whatever comes up in our front end? So let's say the user types in some stuff here, and we want to, before those options get passed to the front end, we want to work with those options. That is kind of the first task of the backend code. And I'm going to start with this help property here. Let's say there is no help property defined by the user, and we want to provide some basic help text when nothing is entered here. So we can define whatever we send back to the API with our own props definition here in the backend. So this is our field definition. Then there comes a props definition, very similar to what we see in Vue.js. Now this is specifically Kirby. So we have a props definition, and we can define our props that are used in the backend, and then send to the API here in this list and say, okay, we have a help prop. And props are always defined as functions. And whatever is being returned from that function is then being sent to the API. This is how it works. So this is our help for the fields. This would mean there is no option to modify the help every time this text is being sent to the API and it ends up in our field. And we can see this here. So this makes it a static value basically that we can use in Vue.js that comes from the backend, and we can use that in simple ways. Let's say we want to make this company address here configurable, then we create a new company property and return company.com here, and we would then create a property up here called company and make that a string, and we would use it here instead of what we had. Okay, it has to be this way. I'm making a mistake. What is my mistake? What? What is my mistake? Okay. Company props. Demo time. Okay, I didn't reload it because it's coming from the back end. So yeah, here we go. So yes, now we can finish that up. Whew. I love when that happens, live coding. So yeah, Why would we do this? Why would we get this from the backend? This seems kind of weird, but it totally makes sense as soon as we start using, for example, the option helper from Kirby, and then we can get this thing from the option now, from the options, from the config. So we would load it from the config file, for example, and then if we have a look at our config file, I think I even passed it in there while testing this. So yeah, you could have a company in here now, company value, and it would load that company value from the config file now in our backend code for our field, send it to the field could use it as a property and then put it in there. So that would be a very simple connection between backend and front end. So that would be like a static property that cannot be modified from the blueprint. But with the help, of course, it makes a lot more sense to make this configurable. And when you want to make it configurable, you can basically do this and say, okay, the value from the blueprint is coming in here into our function. We take that value and pass it back. So now we can just instantly pass it back and say, okay, we don't do anything about it. That is not that helpful. We could say, okay, help text should always be converted to lowercase. Well, we can discuss if this is super helpful, but just to give you an example, demo, and then it would be converted to lowercase. So you could do all kinds of manipulation of those options before they are sent. Maybe things that make more sense than that is you could validate those props. So you could say, okay, I check what kind of value comes in here, and if the value is not like help me, I throw an exception. That would be something that could be done. Help must be help me, and then you can use that to validate your props in a way that will then be visible in the panel. So you can check for valid props like this, you can manipulate props, all of those things are possible. The way that those props are defined is always also interesting. So when you define a prop function like this without a argument fallback, that prop is being expected. So if that prop doesn't exist in your YAML file, it will also throw an error. So if we remove this here, it will give us an error that we have to provide a value for help. As soon as we provide any kind of fallback for the help value, the error disappears, and then it's optional to specify that option or not. That fallback can also be used to provide some kind of fallback text. So this is a fallback text, and then this will be injected whenever there is nothing set up in the blueprint. So those are the options that you have with those props, to manipulate the text, to convert it to anything that you need, or to provide static values from the backend. They can come from the config, they can come from Kirby data. So you could do things like get the site title here and return that site title, or get a specific value from any page that you have. Maybe that's something that makes sense. Whatever you come up with that can be done in the backend can basically be sent back through the API like this. One more important step is, or one important use case that we often use, is that we make those options translatable. So especially for the help property or for the label property, it's quite useful if you work with an international team, that the team is able to translate, or that you are able to translate those options to multiple languages. So when the user switches the language in the interface, they get the help text in their language. So for help, we have this syntax, or for label as well, where you say, okay, das ist Deutsch, this is English. And then you can define more languages like this, and add your translations according to what kind of team members you have working on this. And this wouldn't really work in the way that we did it like now. So if we just return this untransformed, we would end up with an object of those translations in our view component, so not really helpful. But this is easily solvable with our internationalization class, which has a translate option. And this translate option takes the array and then compares it with the current language that is being set up in Kirby, and then returns the string for that language. One little thing though, the translate option, when it cannot find anything in the array, or if the value is not passed as array, the second argument will be used. And you can now either give your own fallback here and say, okay, if it's not translated, I put my own fallback in here. Or what we always do is we put the help as fallback again. So that means if it's not an array, it will use the string text, and otherwise it will try to translate that array. So now it becomes, it works in both ways. So you can either have the array, or you can have just a string and remove the array, and then the help text still works. And yeah, it still turns up in the front end. Those are props. All kinds of things you can do with them. They can be extended in any way you want. Always keep in mind, you have a prop here, you define the prop in your component, and then you can use them. That's basically how it works, and that's how the connections work. And whatever you do with those props is 100% up to you. There's a lot of possibilities in there. I hope it was helpful this week. As I said before, the next step would be to take that, what we had so far, and go beyond a simple input. Those field components or those field plugins are the first thing that comes to mind when thinking about a field is something like this. But there is hardly, well, there's so much you can do with such inputs. But there's so much more you can do with interactive components in Vue.js. So a field does not just have to be an input, it can be a to-do list or something like our structure field, which is just a very complex editing interface built within a field component. The nice part about this is that thinking about a field really is more like thinking about a little tiny app within Kirby, especially with Vue.js. It's very easy to have its own state, to work on all kinds of data manipulation before you send whatever is in the field back to the panel. So you can do all kinds of crazy things in there a lot easier than you would normally be able to with our jQuery backend in Kirby 2. And that would be the third and probably the final part of this field series. And afterwards, we could maybe have another look at sections. They work very similarly, so there's not much to learn there in terms of what I already showed. So you can use that knowledge for sections as well, build your section plugins from there on, and get very specialized in extending the panel. Thank you very much for listening again. Have a wonderful weekend for those of you who've been watching live, and see you next week probably. Thank you.